Hello, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're located. I'm Jason Goodhand, the Global Energy Storage Leader for DNV. I'll be moderating today's session on storage and wind in North America. We hope to take a look at how renewables pair with storage and what applications there might be in the near term or in the future. I'm joined today by three speakers on this panel. Marco Ferreira from Form Energy, Emily Wolf from GE Renewable Energy's Hybrid Solutions, and the third speaker is my colleague from DNV Energy Systems, Mike Kleinberg, who is Head of Energy Storage and Distributed Energy Resources for North America. Now, Mike and myself will be part of a Meet the Experts session after Q&A at the end of the panel. But first, I'd like to introduce Emily from GE. If you could introduce yourself a little bit and tell us what Hybrid Solutions is working on at GE.
Yeah, sure, pleasure. And first of all, thank you for having me join the panel. It's a pleasure. I effectively lead our sales efforts in a fairly new business unit of GE Renewable Energy, which is the Renewable Hybrids business unit. And we really have kind of two core segments that we're working in that space. One is obviously solar plus storage, and then we've got another one which is really wind plus storage, or wind with solar, or wind plus solar plus storage, and the latter is really where I play globally. And as such, but there's plenty of things happening in that space across the globe. I'm sure we'll talk about it as we kind of go along in this panel, but that's about me.
Great, thanks, Emily. And Marco, Form Energy is a fairly new company that some of our wind energy customers might not be familiar with yet. Could you tell us about your role there and a little bit about the company?
Yeah, absolutely. I lead business development and analytics, and we keep these two activities very much intertwined as we think that the future of renewable grids requires insight driven by analytics that then essentially motivates product development and business development. And in terms of what Form Energy is doing, well, we're developing an incredible new thing, which is this super low cost electrochemical storage solution that on an energy basis is so cheap that you can develop it and deploy it in a days duration instead of today's hours of duration. And so effectively unlocks infinite possibilities playing with renewables to shape them, deeply shape them, to co-optimize them, to co-optimize them with transmission, effectively opens up a whole new space of opportunities.
Great, thanks, Marco. Well, let's get into our panel questions. In the previous session, we had Matthew Rowe from DNV speaking about what the energy outlook might look like in 10, 20, 30 years and how storage might play a role in really high penetration grids for economic purposes. But I'm curious about what's happening now. Where is storage being used, whether it's paired with renewables or not? Mike, maybe you could give us a little snapshot of where we're seeing storage, particularly in North America, being used.
Sure. Yeah, it's good to be with you all today. So as Jason mentioned, we're seeing storage in a number of places. And I understand this conference or this session is about wind plus storage, but we're going to make some distinctions here about where we are now in North America with wind plus storage and where we think we're headed. At the present moment, the bulk of storage deployments in North America are being deployed alongside solar resources, or as what we call standalone energy storage projects. So the bulk of storage projects being developed in 2020, 2019, and likely in 2021, where we are now, will be storage coupled with solar projects, where the primary application is through some type of contracted revenue stream to a utility off-taker, where you're looking to shift the energy being produced by the solar resource to later hours of the day, typically, but also some additional flexibility. Beyond that, we have merchant projects for standalone batteries being deployed in markets such as ERCOT, where a full value stack of services is being leveraged from the battery, which is providing both energy, real time and day ahead, as well as a variety of ancillary services which can be monetized according to the current market prices, sometimes with some type of hedge product where a certain number of years of the product is guaranteed to be provided or guaranteed to be sold at a certain price. So currently those markets are merchant and ERCOT. We see a lot of hybrid renewables, solar plus storage in California and other markets, Massachusetts, and then standalone storage is now starting to bubble up across North America in various places as utilities are looking to do some of their first large-scale storage projects.
And Amelie, with your global experience, is that what you're typically seeing in other areas, or do you have any different examples of where you're seeing a lot of storage being deployed today?
I'd say, there are certain locations across the globe where the grid is fairly weak, particularly compared to the US. So sometimes there, if you go to Japan, Hokkaido, right, it's a simple requirement from the grid operator that if and when you're putting a fairly still flexible generation source onto the grid, that you come with some capacity of storage, right? So that's really for selfish and kind of grid protection reasons rather than an actual financial business case behind it. We are seeing, to be very honest, globally, and I'm kind of thinking that'll eventually also become interesting in North America, indeed more wind, solar, storage, maybe some even conventional to it, right? Whether that's diesel or some form of gas, and all of it really as one solution provide what we call dispatchable renewable energy to a system, right? So not necessarily just in parentheses, wind coupled with storage, but an entire bunch of technologies, fuels, again, green and gray, being coupled to really kind of go down that path of replacing other conventional sources that do come along with 60 plus capacity factors. So that's what I see more than, in parentheses, just wind plus storage. But in the US, we predominantly see it where there's capacity RFPs, and again, wind, because of its high capacity factors, paired and coupled with storage, competing against, again, conventionals. We do see it in a few ISOs, indeed, for other revenue cases that Michael already laid out. It'll be interesting to see what will happen with offshore. I think that there's a play there, and maybe even, even though onshore wind is so much larger, but maybe even more of a business case, immediate business case in offshore versus onshore, but TBD.
Back to you, Mike, for a second. You'd mentioned that a lot of the deployments in North America to date have been with solar. Why is that? Why is it more solar than wind?
There's the kind of clean answers, which are that currently storage paired with solar is eligible for the federal ITC, which provides a significant capex reduction that applies to the storage component of a solar plus storage project, as well as not just the solar, if they're paired together. And that has driven a lot of the economics for pairing, these low-cost hybrid PPA contracts that we've seen for solar plus storage projects. What also drives that, though, however, is the large deployment of solar in certain markets, leading to net load shapes like the duck curve, which is famous in California, where you're looking to have overgeneration at some part of the day in the afternoon, and then you have this large ramp period when solar starts to go away, and that these hybrid projects allow you to better shape that net load curve. That net load curve is also interesting for wind plus storage because, for example, in New England and Massachusetts, where they have higher offshore wind and onshore wind targets, recently last year, the Massachusetts Energy Commission released their plan to have a clean peak standard. And what they did is projected by 2030, even with a large penetration or projected penetration of offshore wind, at 3.2 gigawatts by 2030 of offshore wind and 5 gigawatts of solar, they still were getting very, very little based on their projections, renewable energy during peak hours of the winter. So this net load shape will continue to drive hybrid solutions and show where the value comes from shifting this renewable energy from times of production and low net load to times of non-production of renewables when there's high net load on the system. And this clean peak standard is going to drive the wind plus storage market likely into the future, where you're shifting not just solar energy, but a combination of renewable energy from solar, onshore and offshore wind.
Thanks. It sounds like that tax credit makes things a little uneven today, but maybe that'll change in the future.
Yes, that's right.
Marco, I know part of what Form's doing in order to assist their customers in seeing the real value of your low-cost, long-duration technology is some of the analysis of grids and congestion and things. Have you looked at some of the differences of solar and wind, or do you have any particular insights into where wind and storage might be paired well?
Yeah, no, this was great. So there have been a few excellent points made on this panel. So first of all, the power of hybrid solutions, absolutely. And this is mathematically true. When you have more degrees of freedom, you're always going to get to a lower cost solution or a more optimal solution. So if you can play, for example, with a combination of a renewable fuel, so renewable resource, and then a combination of a short duration and a long duration energy storage system, you can do pretty much everything you want. And you know, that's very interesting because now it's not just about, for example, tackling a duck curve or intraday volatility. It's about replacing completely a baseload asset with a clean resource. That becomes possible and cost effective if you have the right pieces. And we've seen this in many locations, right? Where, for example, customers are looking at replacing not the peaker function anymore, but like the mid-merit plant or the baseload coal plant. And, you know, these are plants that do not only fulfill a cheap energy function or an affordable energy function, they fulfill an important reliability function, right? They ride through and they run through a variety of weather conditions. Well, with the right hybrid solution that comprises the right renewable fuels, in short duration and long duration, you can tackle that challenge cost effectively. So that's super interesting. The other point that you made, Jason, about the difference between solar resource and wind resource and what gets more optimally paired. So at a high level, I think you can say that you know, solar pairs better with, say, a few hours of lithium ion because the pattern is mostly diurnal, and long duration storage, cost-effective long duration storage pairs better with wind, where the pattern is more like in several days in a row. So you can see strong wind for several days, and then wind lulls for several days, and so on and so forth. So intuitively, you can say that's true, but where that equation breaks is really when you start to push for high availability requirements, which we've grown accustomed to in power grids, right? We look at a good asset, good fossil fuel asset runs a 95% plus availability. Grids are designed for 1 in 10 year event, right? So when you start pushing to the level of availability, reliability that we've grown accustomed to, all of a sudden, you know, even a plant primarily or a hybrid plant primarily predicated on a solar resource can use some amount, an optimal amount of long duration storage. Because even like a good solar resource is sometimes intermittent on the time scale multiple days.
Right. Okay, so in addition to just some of the economics of tax policy, we also see that the diurnal pattern of solar, it's coming on every day, it's disappearing every day, creates a lot of opportunities for today's lithium batteries. But with wind, we might be looking to longer duration. One of the things that I get a lot of interest from the wind community on is curtailment. If you can't sell your energy, then it's basically lost. It's $0 per megawatt hour. And so people think, well, why don't I try and store that? I wonder if any of you have had any experience with looking at whether that's a good application today or whether it's doesn't quite click. Emily, do you have any insight into applications where folks have used this for curtailment purposes or congestion?
So to be very honest, I've rarely, maybe even never, seen a case play out where you would just be putting a battery storage in place for curtailment capture. And again, that might be something, right, maybe in the future for offshore that's more appealing because you're getting a massive kind of inflow of energy in megawatt hours at a certain point. And if things in offshore also go down the path of that you're allowed to effectively overbuild, right, versus your POI, maybe it's as a standalone, single, isolated business case, it may be worth it. I have not seen it play out financially. I'm not saying that it technically doesn't make sense. It makes a whole lot of sense, right? But at the end of the day, what you're capturing needs to pay, and the revenue you're earning from the otherwise curtailed megawatt hours being sold needs to pay for the battery. And in the instances we've looked at, and we've done a few, right, because it's so obvious, it's kind of the first case that everyone looks at, standalone, very likely not attractive, or not attractive under the assumption that you're financing this project without subsidies, without any grants, kind of normal project finance conditions, right? So you very likely always need to look into identifying further application, right? That famous revenue stacking or application stacking certainly also applies for just doing curtailment capture with a battery storage asset. But that's my experience. I mean, I don't know, I leave it to Michael and Marco to prove me wrong, but that's what we've observed on our cases.
Yeah, I think it's for the same, dispelling kind of the myth of storage as just a buy low, sell high asset. Building a business case purely on arbitrage for a standalone battery is very difficult, if not impossible, due to the infrequency and the price spread. You need to have a very large price spread, but you need to have that very often in order to build some type of business case around arbitrage. And that doesn't, even for some of the locations that look very attractive, that typically doesn't pan out. For the same reasons, purely from a curtailment perspective, where you're getting free or actually getting paid to charge the battery, it still just doesn't happen frequent enough. And you're not going to get revenue certainty far enough out into the future that problem won't be alleviated at some point in order to build a business case purely around either curtailment avoidance or capture or purely revenue arbitrage or price arbitrage.
Now, Mike, go ahead, Marco.
Yeah, I wanted to just add, I totally agree with Amelie and Michael and their perspective on this. There is probably an exception, which is, so, sometimes measuring the value against marking the value to market and energy prices does not tell the whole story. Transacting markets tend to be myopic in this sense, as in like problems materialize very late, and when they show, they're very severe. There are other entities. There are more like vertically integrated entities with a long-term planning horizon and approach to procurement, where, for example, the value of co-optimizing renewable resources with transmission, avoiding curtailment, and carrying those clean electrons into load pockets with the intent of meeting tight decarbonization goals, that's valuable and that's valued. But it depends very much on the business model and the customer, right? I do agree that in transactive markets, wholesale markets, arbitrage on its own or curtailment avoidance on its own do not pencil.
I think it's maybe important too to clarify to Marco's point, the type of arbitrage that I'm referring to is kind of the short time intraday arbitrage, where a short duration battery can capture the price spread between a few hours of the day. But as we move into the future and we have much larger penetrations of renewables, the harder to abate will be, as we get to higher penetrations, the harder to abate capacity. And that's where we start to look at long duration storage as a potential solution to move large chunks of energy. And for that, you likely need a different technology than the lithium ion batteries of today.
Mike, I had a question about, if storage has value as a standalone asset, is there still value in co-locating storage with wind? Is there, just sharing the same site? Is there some value there?
Yeah, and I think that's where we see many developers currently looking at wind plus storage in North America. They look at it currently as a capex savings project. So the amount of land, and this works for solar as well, the amount of land and development cost for a storage project is much, much less than that of a wind or a solar project. So when you're developing a wind or solar project, you have your land, you have your interconnect, you have other project development costs already sunk into the project. The incremental cost then of adding storage becomes less and less. So co-locating projects, wind, solar, and storage you can reduce capex of those individual projects when you start to co-locate, even if you're not necessarily mixing the revenue streams.
All right. Marco or Emily, did you have anything you wanted to add on co-location specifically? Or?
No, I think I echo that experience. I think the biggest benefit of co-location is around savings, whether that's in the civil or electrical BOP, is around maybe in certain instances less so obviously for solar and wind, because you still need to acquire land either for wind or for solar or for battery. So you can put it next to the substation, have a few more square meters of laydown area for the containers. So it's not, there's no substantial incremental land cost. So it is a way, co-locating a battery with something else is a way to reduce the dollar per kilowatt or kilowatt hour expense on the battery. So it does make sense from that perspective. So I echo what Michael said. I still think it makes a lot of sense to co-locate.
And from a value standpoint, just I want to add there is probably the added benefit of optimizing interconnect capacity. Location of storage and renewables is sometimes driven, strongly driven by transmission topology, where it kind of makes sense to put them. And if you're, for example, looking at a case of oversizing, solar or wind, and then trying to optimize your interconnect capacity, you may want to locate an energy storage system to do time shifting there and push as many electrons as possible into the interconnect. Sometimes this is, technically is a no-brainer, and in some cases actually, could pencil out. Emily was pointing to the case of offshore wind. We think that there is an opportunity there for optimizing interconnect with storage. Sometimes it's a matter of kind of regulatory constraints, honestly. That make it unnecessarily complicated to design these hybrid systems, right? And so that's an area where we need to make a lot of progress.
Yeah, to Marco's last point there too, we're seeing market operators try to keep up with the fast evolution of hybrid systems and co-location, and we're seeing certain market ISOs looking to address those issues. Right now you need a separate resource ID for each resource. How do you separate hybrid versus co-located, which may be at the same interconnect point? And both the transmission and the market operators are looking to keep up with their regulations to try to address these different issues, but it's not always going to happen in time.
And Mike, from a beyond just regulatory, are there any upcoming policy changes in North America that might change how wind and storage might roll out in the near future? Clean Peak Standard?
I think, the Clean Peak Standard is what I mentioned earlier. I think that's kind of one of the easy ones to point at. It's been on the docket for a number of states for some time, but we've seen Massachusetts actually move forward and implement and try to put a dollar value on the size of the incentive for generating during these peak net load areas for this the state. As ITC, as the PTC potentially expires, and which has been driving much of the wind development, I think we'll also see an interplay of how storage will then maybe be more attractive to wind developers as kind of the current structure of incentives falls away. So I think it's one of new developments, and always on the horizon the potential for standalone storage. ITC, particularly with the new administration in North America, will change kind of the landscape of storage incentive.
So that if ITC were applied to standalone, you'd kind of negate the advantage that solar has over wind, at least from the tax policy.
It's entirely possible. Yeah, you have just a different balance of how you co-locate, or whether you could do hybrid projects, no longer tied to the solar ITC credit.
All right. One of the other areas I think of storage being used as an early use case is microgrids, where the economics are a bit different. And Emily, does GE have some experience around microgrids that have wind, or what are you seeing in that space?
I wouldn't. So I'm not sure if we're using the nomenclature in the same way. What we do see now more and more is indeed large energy consumers, traditional off-takers of PPAs, thinking about their own on-site generation. And typically, they'd like that on-site generation to deliver very close to the load curve. And again, that's where we not necessarily just wind and storage again, but a combination of several technologies that jointly together, if you put all of their generation profiles and add them up, do deliver over a long period over the day, ideally, right, that the majority of the operating hours for a facility, they deliver energy. And that's where I think we may see things moving, because you also have a lot of these blue chip companies also now moving along the sustainability and wanting to be 100% green. I mean, we're one of them, to be very honest. But I think all of these things kind of drive also more and more penetration of wind, of storage, of something else, whatever that is, solar, again, gas, depending on what geography you are. You will naturally see more of that coming as people try to be self-sufficient and have their own on-site generation. But that's how I interpret microgrid. I know that the nomenclature is broadly used, but that's the kind of microgrids that we find interesting and where we support.
And Mike, have you seen anything similar? Do you have a North American perspective on microgrids? Are they common here, or are they really relegated more to remote areas and islands, or what do you see?
Yeah, microgrids have been on the horizon for quite some time, with their primary benefit generally being off-grid or reliability focused add-ons. The applications that have been most successful have been the ones where there's some type of high reliability need, where microgrid functionality can be monetized or directly monetized in some way. Where we are seeing some interest in North America is the concept of community microgrids, which act as potential resiliency centers for cities, in which case you are looking for some type of high reliability, long duration survivability in the event of a natural disaster or other event, where folks can come charge their phones, or you can use that as a hub. And that has been seen some popularity in some states and localities or municipals. But generally, we're still seeing microgrids being an off-grid, where the grid is weaker, you're trying to integrate more renewables and you want some additional functionality. Some of the projects in the renewable projects, even in Hawaii, are now looking at some increased functionality from their hybrid plants to allow for more resiliency in the event of some of the large generators tripping offline. They want the hybrid renewables with renewables plus storage to supply part of the island. So even some of the larger islanded grids, I think, are now looking at hybrids as resiliency assets. But that's that needs to be coordinated with all the protections that are on the transmission grid supplying that region. So it starts to become a more complex problem, but the technology seems to be moving in a direction where it can supply those services.
All right. I wanted to shift gears and I see we're coming up to the Q&A period, and there's a question about different technologies. One thing I guess I should say for the benefit of our audience is almost all of what we see in the market today for storage has been lithium, and that's due to the proliferation of cell phones, laptops, and especially EVs, which have really brought the cost down. A question for Marco is, is lithium going to own this space? Will it get replaced with something? Will it share a place at the top with other technologies? What's your insight on that?
Oh, we're extremely bullish on lithium. I think lithium is gonna continue to come down in price. We believe in some of the more aggressive forecasts, and if you think of kind of storage in buckets of duration that kind of roughly are indexed to buckets of needs in future grids, we think that lithium ion will easily take the bucket, say, shorter than a day, possibly up to 10 hours in 2030 and up to 20 hours in 2040 cost effectively. There is still this uncharted space of the multi-day electrical storage problem. We have multi-day storage for any other sort of commodity. We don't have multi-day storage for electricity, and that's where Form Energy is really focusing. Say our view on the future is that there's going to be a super strong lithium-ion market in the up to a day duration space, and then there is this open opportunity of the multi-day space. We're certainly playing in the latter. We think there are contenders, but probably not so many. And as far as technology kind of in between, I think they need to demonstrate their ability to come to market and down in cost very fast, because lithium ion is going to continue on its unstoppable march and scale, and it is a serious threat.
So that kind of leads me very well into the first question that we have from our audience is, what is the future of flow-type batteries? So maybe I'll stick with you just for a second, Marco, and ask, is Form Energy's solution considered a flow battery or similar? And if not, if we're thinking about more classically familiar vanadium flow redox batteries, where do we think they're going to go? Are they done? Are they headed to a good spot? Maybe your opinion, please.
I'm not going to comment on other technologies, competing technologies. I can say our technology is truly innovative. It is very, very low cost. It is static battery, and it is optimized for a space of application that is multi-day. So we're far from the space of application where vanadium flow and other flow batteries are currently competing. We are very bullish on lithium-ion. It's similar to the story that we saw play out with solar PV, right? Ultimately, the incumbent technology, which is essentially commodity crystalline silicon, poly or mono, essentially beat everybody else, with the exception of a few, actually probably only one alternative technology company. And we think that could play out again.
Amelie and Mike, do you have any experience with flow batteries or any thoughts on, the benefits or challenges that technology is going to have?
I mean, ourselves, we have made a long, I'd say, research on indeed what battery storage technology to focus on, and then what chemistry to focus on. We have also gone down the lithium kind of path and believe that that's, at least for the time being, for the things that we want to do in solar, wind, very likely has the biggest applicability, and to Marco's point, bigger scale, and with scale, with economies of scale, there is a very attractive price return. There's many things that kind of drive a decision as to what if you go with lithium, if you go with something else. It's not just one isolated number, right? It's many factors. It's density, it's safety, and safety is becoming more and more important. It's time to commission, it's availability, it's credibility of manufacturers, right? Are they bankable? Can I get the 20-year, 25-year performance guarantee out of them? So all of these factors effectively drive a decision as to which technology, and within the different technology segments, what chemistry, for example, right? If you say on the battery storage path, again, we place the bet. We believe in lithium for the time being. It is one of, if not one of the very few battery storage technologies right now that are accepted, that are bankable, and that is an important factor, right? No one really wants to carry that on their own balance sheet with equity, and as such, there's very little alternatives right now, to be honest, right? That to lithium. And even battery storage. I mean, everything else does take its time to be built. Start with pump storage. There's even further prerequisites that you need to have in place to build something like that. Thermal storage the same way. So again, for the time being, we think that's a good solution for what we try to do.
All right. Mike, there's a question here that got a couple of votes. It says there are projects of battery storage in electric substations for improving regulations to the power system. So could you talk a bit about what you've seen maybe for like frequency and voltage control applications, and maybe how that might apply to wind or the grid around assets?
Yeah, I think with energy storage, you have a variety of ancillary services that you can provide to the market, and then also kind of grid services, so grid code compliance type services where you're providing very primary frequency control and or voltage control. So we typically think of the different applications of, are you sending a signal to the battery to charge or discharge at maybe even at a high frequency, like every 2 seconds, or is the battery reacting immediately based on local grid conditions? So it's monitoring the line frequency or the line voltage and then charging or discharging with some response to that condition. Storage is very flexible, and we've seen a number of applications where it actually is doing both. So in the case of Hawaii, for example, the battery is typically there to shift energy. But if the grid frequency that the battery is measuring goes below a certain point, it shifts into a primary frequency response mode and immediately starts dumping energy onto the grid to try to stabilize the grid frequency. So it's certainly a viable application. In many cases, it's not typically the primary or only application. However, we do see cases where you have a very immediate need for some type of grid stabilization, and storage can typically be deployed faster than other resources. And to Amelie's earlier point, some grids in some regions of the world are requiring storage with renewables specifically to address these issues of renewables injecting potential grid stability issues, and storage being on site to balance those and provide these kind of more smooth output to the grid.
Okay, thanks, Mike. We have another question, and it relates to hydrogen and how it might compare with battery systems. We did have a session earlier today. Unfortunately, I was still asleep, being here in North America when that was going on. But so DNV's probably given its opinion on hydrogen so far, but perhaps Amelie or Marco. Marco, I know you have compared your long duration with hydrogen. Any thoughts as to whether the proliferation of green hydrogen solutions is going to replace the need for BESS battery energy systems?
Yeah, that's great, Justin. That's a very interesting topic. So what we've heard in the market, and kind of concluded with our own analysis, is that green hydrogen will have so many more profitable uses before people think of burning it back into electricity. So if there is a use in terms of kind of electrical storage, as if you're producing it, and then you're burning it back, or you're running it back to a fuel cell to produce electricity to feed back into the grid, that's probably low on the stack of value applications. And so, although, again, we're bullish on green hydrogen, we think that it's a fantastic energy carrier, and certainly probably one of the very few solutions to decarbonize hard to decarbonize industries. We don't think that burning it back into electricity is necessarily a great idea at the beginning, not the highest value application. But there are cases, the specific circumstances, where the economics of long duration hydrogen electrical storage makes sense. Those circumstances are typically characterized by the fact that your tank comes for free. So it's you're storing hydrogen in a cavern, in an existing natural formation, geological formation. The tank comes for free. You also are able to access maybe gas plants that can be retrofitted to burn hydrogen or large amounts of hydrogen, push it back into the grid as electricity. So there are specific circumstances where the economics can work out for very long duration multi-day storage. But in general, we don't think that electrical storage via hydrogen is the most profitable application of green hydrogen.
Okay. Amelie, does GE Hybrids have any experience to date looking at hydrogen in place of battery storage?
No, not really, to be honest. And I think technically, again, hydrogen is very, very interesting and absolutely has a place. I think, again, if you put yourselves in the shoes of people that want to execute projects today, it is still somewhat away from being a product or a way to market that is reaching scale anytime soon, right? The projects that are out there are typically R&D related projects with quite some subsidies and, again, grants going into it, because no one really has grabbed the business case for it, the market, what do I do then with it? And so long as that doesn't play out, I don't see it, coming into the market with a boom and taking share from other technologies within the next 5-6 years, right? I think you have more and more interesting projects coming. Again, I think there's kind of a natural play with offshore, naturally. But right now, we support it more from what feeds the electrolyzer, right? Which again is wind, solar, or could be wind, could be solar. But beyond that, we haven't yet kind of planted seeds to really play in that space beyond, as I said, feeding the electrolyzer and then letting the value chain from there be covered by other players.
Okay. I see we have about a minute left to our panel or less, so I might start to wrap up. I'd like to thank both of our guests, Marco and Amelie. I think today's session was really good, and I actually had more questions that I was going to ask. We touched on a lot of different topics, so I think this was a great way to end out the last panel of the day. I'll let the two of you go, and Mike and myself will hang around to answer more questions in our DNV Meet the Experts portion. So thanks a lot.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
So I will start by talking or answering some of the questions I see here in the question box, and I believe Mike Kleinberg is going to return in a second and join me. One of the questions here is, how would climate affect the battery energy storage system? I think one of the things that's important to think about here is many of the lithium systems that we have to date, they do need, the batteries themselves are highly affected by temperature. As those of you who drive a car know that if it's very cold, you don't get as much energy out. With lithium in particular, you don't want to necessarily overheat them as well. So most systems have either an air cooling or water cooling system where they have fluids, heat conductors to take heat away from the cells and really maintain almost a room temperature type of situation. So the systems in a battery or the subsystems in a battery energy storage system outside of the batteries themselves, one of the biggest pieces is HVAC, so the control of the thermal conditions for batteries. One of the next questions I see is, how do you see second life automotive batteries being used in ESS systems, and how will their prices drive use? So, as most of you know, when you're driving a car, an electric car, at some point, the battery will have degraded to a point where your range is shortened. So perhaps at around 80% capacity or somewhere around there, you might take your EV into the shop and get a brand new battery. The remaining battery still has a bunch of capacity to it, and its value is quite low in terms of that the car doesn't want to use it anymore. There are companies who are looking at collecting those batteries, assembling them into static systems and using them at a sort of close to zero charge. And so the business plan there would be, how can you reduce the capital cost of your system? If batteries are expensive and you can get used ones, that might really impact your capex. What's been the case to date is there's been a bit of a moving target. So lithium batteries were expensive when they were put in a car. They're cheap to recollect, but we see that new batteries are declining in price and increasing in performance. So there's been a bit of a weird balance that we're not at a static point where new batteries aren't decreasing very sharply and used batteries are at a key lower price. One of the other things to consider is there are additional costs to taking used EV batteries and trying to assemble them into a system that has to now be designed around that pack or those cells, as opposed to designing all of your systems around one new supplier. I don't know, Mike, if you have any particular EV second life experience?
Yeah, we did. So one anecdote I can tell you is we did some testing for NYSERDA a couple of years back, maybe 3 years back now, looking at taking some used electric bus batteries and then putting them through some paces for grid type profiles. Again, this is earlier generation technology, but what we found is doing initial capacity tests on those battery packs showed an extremely wide band of day one capacity, for the second life. And then depending on that initial capacity point, the state of health that you got the second life battery pack at, the type of profile you then run on that battery will dramatically impact how much actual useful work you can get out of it. So if you take a fairly well degraded battery and then put it into a fairly aggressive use case like frequency regulation, just the O&M cost of constantly replacing those, you're not going to get very much mileage out of that. But even for some of those fairly well degraded batteries that you did more gentle type of shifting low C rate applications, you were able to get multiple years of potential useful life from that at very low cost. So it's really going to be a process, I believe, of binning and kind of figuring out an efficient way to get the ones that are worth putting into a second life application, and then also making sure they're being used in applications which are appropriate for such a product. That glosses over the large issue of safety. One major hurdle for second life batteries will be figuring out how to recertify these older technologies or integrate those technologies into enclosures which are deemed safe and can mitigate any potential safety issues by continuing to use these.
Great, thanks, Mike. We have another question that says, could you say something about virtual inertia? And just for background for the audience, as many of you probably know, when you have a spinning turbine, like many coal or gas plants that support the base of the grid right now, all of the electronic inverters on solar or battery systems will typically follow the cycle of the grid. They don't have to generate the 60 hertz cycle of the grid. And when things do change, the spinning rotors in coal or gas turbines have what's called inertia. So they actually, just by their momentum or whatever, help hold the cycle of the grid and firm it up. As we get a higher and higher number of what we'll call inverter-based technologies, we'll have less of that inertia on the grid, and that's a concern for grid stability. I guess up until now, there hasn't been enough renewables or inverter-based generation to actually push us into a dangerous area, or at least not on any of the grids that I'm familiar with. But there will come a point where we'll need to figure out, can inverters create that inertia? I don't know. Mike, is that anything that you've looked at or have any experience in?
I think that inverter-based grid forming is a demonstrated application. It's certainly technically feasible that you can model an inverter controller to mimic the swing equation or the first and second order dynamics of kind of current generator-based electrical grids. However, that is a somewhat sophisticated control problem that needs to be coordinated across all of the devices. So right now we have many, many different vintages, makes and models of inverters running different controls on the grid. So if you do want to have a purely inverter-based, large-scale electrical grid that can be resilient against large swings in load, you need to ensure that the controls are coordinated across all of those devices. So it's technically feasible to do it where you have a very high understanding of the electrical grid characteristics, and you can have control over the primary inverters, which will be controlling the frequency. The problem just becomes more challenging as you get to larger grids with larger numbers of devices. So technically feasible and a problem that will absolutely need to be solved as we head towards 100% renewable or even just large penetration renewable grids.
You know, thanks, Mike. Our next question kind of looks at what will happen as certain things change in magnitude on the grid, and that's EVs. So it says, what about using existing operating car batteries for load shifting with the appropriate technology and software? You know, so basically, I think what this is hinting towards is what we call V2G, or vehicle to grid. You have a huge power plant inside each vehicle that's capable of powering much more than a single home that it's attached to. With all this extra battery being connected to the grid at certain times, there's the ability for it to provide storage services. Personally, I've looked at this a little bit in the energy technology outlook that DNV produces. When we mapped out how much storage would be needed for new lithium or perhaps long duration storage in the future, one of the big impacts, especially in the near term, is the fact that we're going to have a huge set of batteries already out there that are connected to the grid, and it's really going to depend on what percentage of those vehicles will act as either grid balancing or energy shifting storage, and how much is out there, and the economic value of doing so. I don't know, Mike, if you have any particular thoughts on V2G technology and how that might impact future storage growth.
Yeah, I mean, V2G has been a well-studied and researched capability. It's again this kind of concept of it's technically feasible, but there are more practical considerations, as Jason was alluding to, and most notably those are you as an individual vehicle owner are likely not granted warranty or license to then allow your battery to stay within warranty while also providing services to the grid. So those types of more commercial focused challenges likely will be the tougher hurdles. You know, if we existed in a world which looked at problems very holistically, this would be a no-brainer. Unfortunately, there's just more local kind of commercial constraints rather than technical constraints, which would perhaps limit that, or we just need to find solutions for ways to get either the warranties to allow for this type of operation, as well as kind of the incentive for you to put extra wear and tear on your vehicle battery to provide services to the grid. Typically, that would have to come in the form of either a monetary incentive or some other type of benefit.
One of the next questions is kind of interesting. It's, what is the main trend with battery energy storage systems in terms of being power intensive or energy intensive? And I know that if you look at an application like frequency regulation, those might be an hour or less in terms of duration. They can really run at a high C rate, and those would be power applications. And I guess, things like capacity as well, or peak, are also power applications as opposed to energy, which might be longer duration. Mike, what do you see in terms of the trend and why power or why energy based applications?
Yeah, it's interesting. This was a major kind of topic of kind of classifying everything as power versus energy, and battery manufacturers still make differentiated products. Sometimes the only differentiation is kind of the interconnecting equipment having a higher capacity rating. So the core battery technology is many times very similar, but the amount of current you're rated to draw and push into it are higher based on kind of the rest of the balance of plant of that particular piece of equipment. The vast majority of projects now are in the 2 hour or longer region. So these are 2 hour to 4 hour, typically batteries, as opposed to back in 2014 and earlier, we had these kind of very short duration, 15-minute projects that were dedicated to providing frequency regulation 24/7, which would be considered kind of power applications. The number of power applications as dedicated use cases has dramatically declined in the last 6 years, and now we're looking at primarily energy applications. That said, there's still going to be localized cases like frequency response and frequency regulation, which will still rely on those kind of power cells and power applications, but the vast majority now are these energy shifting applications.
Yeah, and I guess I would add to that the if you're only trying to do a power application, a 1 hour battery or a 15-minute battery might be applicable. If you have a system that is 4 hours or longer, you can still provide some of those other services. You just have a much more capitally intensive project for that application. However, you've probably found some energy type use case like shifting that helps provide the merit economically to have that longer system. Let's see what else we have in terms of questions. One of the questions was, why not have storage, solar, and wind all pooled together in one connection? So, this might be if you had 100 megawatt interconnection, could you have, almost 100 megawatts of wind, almost 100 of solar, and some battery, and put all that together to really maximize the use of infrastructure? Mike, I might point this question to you for your thoughts on, can we put a whole bunch of stuff at one connection and really maximize that interconnection?
And I think we didn't get a chance for Amelie to talk about that much, but GE we know is definitely looking at that type of application, and we know other developers are starting to investigate that. There's no question in my mind that we'll see more projects in the next few years, which we anecdotally are calling triple play: solar plus storage plus wind, where you get the time, the natural time benefits of generation of each of those technologies with the balancing capability of the battery to smooth out additional times of low generation or over generation. So there's obvious benefits there. I think we're just a little early for that, but I think there's no question in my mind we'll start to see more of these applications in the next couple of years, particularly as we look at some of the issues that Marco raised around the capacity value, kind of the consistent energy, base load energy of a plant. As we get to higher penetrations of renewables will become more important. And solar plus wind plus a battery is going to be able to provide a much more consistent power output than any one of those technologies alone.
Mike, I have a great question here, which is, our wind customers, especially on the development side, have known for a very long time that location matters. You need to find wind, you need interconnection, you need access to get the land, you need to avoid environmental restrictions. When it comes to storage, is the same place that we might seek to put wind the same place we would put storage, or what might people need to think about in terms of siting and where on the grid it matters to put storage?
Yeah, it's very much dependent on your application. If you're looking at hybrid projects, that's going to be very different than if you're looking for a standalone storage. We can take the standalone storage case first, which is you're trying to find locations where you can market the services from that battery and find at least some projection, which you believe to be certainty of revenue going forward. So locations with higher energy prices or higher price spreads and access to acceptable ancillary service markets. When you're looking at hybrid projects, it's likely that the renewable piece of that project is still going to drive your development effort. So places where you can get the energy, you can get the price spread and things from your delivery point. It's going to drive the projects for the near term. It's going to be typical solar wind project drivers, with storage being an add-on of additional services you can provide on top of that. Again, just the major difference there is if it's standalone, there's a different set of requirements where you're looking for large price spreads and access to ancillary service markets and being able to, get all that energy to the grid all the time, similar to a solar wind project.
Mike, one of the things that we touched upon before was capacity as a service. So the being paid not only for the energy that you generate, but the fact that when called upon, you're able to provide electricity. And renewables have had some difficulty in providing that services simply because if it's not sunny or if it's not windy, you can't provide that service. When pairing with storage, it does seem like that is possible. Can you tell us a little bit about, where are we seeing places in North America where people are combining storage plus wind or solar and getting paid for capacity?
Yeah, absolutely. Most notably, the CAISO market has a resource adequacy requirement of 4 hours for getting full capacity benefit of the battery. So as long as you have a 4-hour battery, you can get full, essentially, capacity credit in that market. As other markets have been forced to start to create these rules through FERC Order 841, they're developing different sets of rules. So and sometimes there's a longer duration, so upwards to 8 hours of capacity, which makes things much more challenging to get kind of your full power capacity of the plant. We're also seeing utilities now issue RFOs for capacity-based storage contracts, where there's either a very strict requirement on full availability during certain months of the year. So you're expected to have 100% availability during kind of peak summer months. With anything less than 100%, you start to get into liquidated damages or other damage structures for the contract. But then you have allowable, regular maintenance hours and unplanned maintenance hours during other times of the year. So we're seeing this certainly evolve for standalone storage and hybrids, where capacity is becoming a bigger part of the contracts, and certainly one of the more bankable revenue streams, because you get paid, you can bank on that for 15, 20, 25 years. So I think this will continue to be a part of the puzzle, and different markets are going to have different requirements. And that differentiation is already happening.
That touches on a really interesting topic of, what's the status of bankability within the battery realm. So when we look to lenders, obviously, there are financiers and investors who are very comfortable with wind and solar at this point. Mike, what do we see in terms of batteries? Is anybody, are lenders applying financing to battery storage systems?
Yeah, absolutely. I think primarily this has been for lithium ion technologies, which have been the bulk of the deployment at DNVGL. The storage team in North America, one of the primary services is providing service to project developers and project finance to do diligence on the technologies, doing bankability reports or technology reviews for the actual integrated project or for the battery cells or other components. But then doing your typical IE service that we've done for solar and wind to support project finance, we're doing for standalone storage and for hybrids. There's an uptake time, so there's certainly more questions. There's newer levels of uncertainty or risk that are assigned to different components of a project. And depending on the type of investor, there's different questions that come down that we're helping answer. Some of the most notable ones being longevity. So batteries are subject to degradation, and the amount of capacity augmentation or replacement that you need to do over a project's life is going to dramatically impact the cost and ultimately the return on investment. So questions around capacity degradation and lifetime, questions around safety, permitting, and code compliance in light of some events have become under increased focus. The performance guarantees, of course, that are being provided with the product, people are trying to get more comfort around, and we're trying to work with OEMs and system integrators to provide us with the data, as well as doing our own independent testing to provide some comfort to lenders that these products will actually last for the amount of time that they say they will under the intended use case. And then, of course, certainty around the revenue stack. So looking at the contract and looking, as we mentioned, around either capacity payments or tolling agreements for these projects, making sure that the product is ultimately going to be able to capture that full revenue stack that's in the financial model to try to reduce any risk of underperformance with respect to payments.
Mike, I know one of the areas where there's strong wind is ERCOT, and that's a merchant market. If you think about a grid being the price being fluctuating, as well as a renewable asset where you don't know when generation is going to happen, certainly, does that seem like it might be an area to use storage to try and match up price with generation? And how in a merchant market might a solution come together? How would you vet the feasibility of such a product?
Yeah, so for merchant projects, I think is an area where bankability and kind of investor confidence is taking a bit longer to get there. And it's going to need to probably get there because it's going to be a lot more merchant risk for storage and hybrid projects going forward. So typically we're looking at, what's the forward price projections for real-time energy, day-ahead energy, and all your ancillary service products at that particular nodal location where the project will be developed. And then in addition to that, what's the volatility? So one of the major economic drivers going forward for grids with a lot of renewables will be kind of arbitraging the real-time volatility in addition to providing the rest of the benefit stack. So getting some kind of firm view on what those forward prices and forward volatility will be at that specific location, and then picking the right size battery and right technology to monetize that in an optimal fashion is typically how a merchant project comes together. In a market like ERCOT, you also have deliverability requirements. And when we look at offshore wind, where you have places like West Texas, where you have potentially challenges getting the power to a load pocket. Storage within those load pockets can potentially arbitrage. Sorry, there's authorities coming by. You can potentially arbitrage the energy so that you can deliver that energy into that load pocket, for example, with offshore wind in a congested area during low net load times. And then you can supply that load pocket with the energy when you maybe have challenges getting it to there during the high load times with the local energy stored in the battery. So a more holistic view of storage usage in markets with high renewables but congestion will likely be a use case that emerges, particularly with offshore wind and other high penetration markets of renewables.
Thanks, Mike. And I think we have time for one last question. So in the in the wind industry, we have OEMs and EPCs. So you might buy turbines from a vendor like Vestas, GE, Siemens, whoever, and then an EPC company who might construct that project for you. How does this work with battery energy storage systems? Well, I can start out by saying there is something similar. There are cell manufacturers, then there are people who build systems, then there are EPCs who will place those systems at a project, but you also have a bit of a spectrum of what people are willing to do within that space. And we have the role of the integrator, who's really the person who kind of grabs the cells and makes sure the system all works together. Mike, can you tell us a bit about what some of the options are? You know, is Tesla an OEM or an integrator? What's this space look like in terms of how you go from the cells to an installed system and who needs to be involved?
Sure, I think you can think about the landscape of the cell manufacturers first, which are your large Korean manufacturers or Japanese or Chinese manufacturers. For example, LG Chem, Samsung, Panasonic, emerging CATL and Lishin and ATL from China. These are folks that are making battery cells, modules, and or rack products that are then typically used by what we call the next step up the chain, which is the integrator. So the integrator buys these products from the cell manufacturers and then integrates them into some type of enclosure, either a standardized enclosure or a customized per project enclosure, which kind of is what you see when you look at a battery storage project from the air. Typically a container with battery racks inside, along with power electronics for your conversion system. And then a developer can then contract with an integrator to get that fully wrapped system, or they could work individually to buy the battery cells and racks, contract with an enclosure manufacturer to make custom product for the developer. So you can take a few different angles depending on how you want to move forward. Those integrators who take the battery cells and modules are the names like Tesla, Powin, Fluence, IHI, Wardzilla. All of these folks have business models where they're buying those cells and racks from a battery manufacturer and then integrating them in some custom enclosure that is typically UL 9540 factory assembled or field certified. So they're either building the thing with the racks in it in a factory and then shipping it whole to a site, or they're shipping an enclosure to the site and then having racks shipped to the site and integrating them on site. And in that case, they'll be field certified to UL 9540 rather than factory UL listed UL 9540 from the factory.
Great, and then it looks like we're running up against the end of our time. One of the last questions I saw was how can we use wind energy in the cement industry? I think basically we'd need to look at how intense is your usage, but assuming that cement is very both carbon and energy intense, you might be able to pair wind and storage so that you could get more of a flat baseline green energy insertion into your equipment. I would also say if you're curious about looking for energy solutions in cement, hydrogen is actually I think possibly an input to that or something that might be green and useful. And I would encourage you to reach out to myself if you'd like some us to put you in touch with some people that have experience there. I guess we're running up to the end of our time. I really want to thank my guests, Amelie and Marco today, as well as Mike for sticking around and answering the bulk of the questions. He's our #1 storage guy here in North America. If you have any further questions, please follow up with the DNV GL team on storage. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.
Pleasure being with you all today.